Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at both the good and bad aspects of the game Baldur's Gate 3 3 years later. What prompted me to make this video is that Larian Studios, the game development team behind Baldur's Gate 3, is actually now currently working on their next project, which is not going to be a sequel to Baldur's Gate 3, but rather an installment in their own IP series, the Divinity series. And as part of that, the studio head actually said they were looking for feedback on areas where they think they did well or poorly in Baldur's Gate 3, and I personally would like to at least offer my 2 cents on that. And of course I also figured while I'm here, since I loved Baldur's Gate 3, I might as well do this as a full review of the game, so anybody that hasn't played it can at least see whether or not they think it might be the right game for them. I imagine there's a pretty good chance that a lot of people watching this video haven't played the original Baldur's Gate game, and that's because that game is from 1998, so it is old enough to both drive and already be on its second marriage. The original Baldur's Gate was also made by a relatively unknown studio at the time, BioWare. In fact, Baldur's Gate was BioWare's very first little adventure into the RPG game landscape. The entire Baldur's Gate franchise is actually based around Dungeons & Dragons and the entire Dungeons & Dragons universe, and that was actually one of the reasons that BioWare cited for why they wanted to do their own intellectual properties. These would later be the series of Dragon Age and Mass Effect, because at least according to BioWare, Wizards of the Coast could be somewhat difficult to deal with. Now, Larian Studios are working on their own IP Divinity after working on Baldur's Gate 3, however they have said that Wizards of the Coast was perfectly fine and they didn't have any issues with them. I do suspect that may be more out of the fact that they don't expect Divinity to do anywhere near as well as Baldur's Gate 3 did, so they want to keep on pretty good terms with Wizards of the Coast just in case they want to make another Baldur's Gate game and want to also see another giant stack of money for doing so. At least that's my read on the situation. Of course, anybody who's familiar with the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons is well aware that saying the game is based on Dungeons & Dragons doesn't really mean all that much. The game has been through quite a few iterations, and some things work very differently now than they did way back when. In fact, the original Baldur's Gate was based on 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, and Baldur's Gate 3 is actually based on 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but more specifically it's based on 5th edition 2014 Dungeons & Dragons, not 5th edition 2024 Dungeons & Dragons, which is incredibly confusing if, like me, you are currently in a campaign using the 2024 5th edition rules. But very importantly, it's not to say Baldur's Gate uses the rules one for one. A lot of the abilities and spell descriptions are basically the same, but there are some minor tweaks to accommodate the different UI and the different manner in which you're going to be playing it. And this somewhat leads into our first critique. Dungeons & Dragons is designed to be a very open-ended role-playing experience, so while there is a lot focused on combat, there's also a lot of non-combat stuff and a lot of things you can do in the middle of combat that aren't necessarily fighting the enemy. And while Larian have done a pretty admirable job of trying to translate a lot of these mechanics to the game, even allowing you to do things like pick up stuff on the ground or throw a chair at somebody, it doesn't always go off without a hitch. Some of the line of sight aspects are incredibly wonky, and I have definitely run into a few bugs in my time playing the game in terms of the combat system not really working as intended. Now, to be fair to Larian Studios, these are pretty uncommon issues. They don't come up all the time, and the biggest issues usually come up when there's an elevation difference between you and the target, which can create some pretty bizarre interactions, such as people phasing through the floor or the game not thinking you have line of sight when you're basically standing right next to them. Now, when you start your first playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3, you will be greeted to this screen, and this screen looks at the various difficult settings. And part of the reason why I mentioned BioWare at the very beginning is because Baldur's Gate 3 actually follows on from the pedigree of the original BioWare games, and anybody who's played the original Mass Effect or the original Dragon Age knows that the difficulty of those games was all over the place. They would just randomly kill you out of nowhere, and Baldur's Gate 3, for better or worse, does carry on that tradition. Some of the hardest fights that you'll have in the game might very well just be a pack of random goblins that are set up for an ambush. So it's not simply that the game is difficult, but rather that it has a very uneven difficulty curve, and where you're going to experience spikes in those difficulty is not exactly consistent, especially if it's your first playthrough and you don't really know what to expect of a given encounter. So with all that being said, if you haven't played Dungeons & Dragons before and haven't really played a whole lot of RPGs before, I would kind of recommend starting on the Explorer difficulty, even though it seems like it might be easy mode. Some of the fights on Explorer mode can actually be pretty difficult if you don't know what to expect. If you are familiar with Dungeons & Dragons and you have played a decent number of RPGs, the balanced difficulty will probably be better suited to you. You'll still run into some reasonably difficult fights, but you're at least coming in with a stronger understanding of the gameplay mechanics to have at least a vague idea of what to expect. Then you have the Tactician difficulty, and even if you have played Dungeons & Dragons and you have played RPGs before, if you haven't specifically played through Baldur's Gate 3 before, I would not recommend Tactician. Tactician is essentially just balance mode on steroids. It has a bunch of extra actions and reactions for bosses, enemies have better hit points, and enemies also tend to use better tactics. Enemies will go out of their way to try and focus fire down weak characters, so if you're leaving characters in bad positions or neglecting upgrading their equipment, you're going to find them dropping like flies. Then you have Honor Mode. Honor Mode is essentially Tactician difficulty, but now it's basically an Iron Man game. You only have one save, and whenever you leave, it automatically saves the game for you. So if you party wipe, then the game is just over, and if you make a mistake, you just have to find a way to live with it. Honor Mode also adds some other restrictions above and beyond the normal Tactician mode. Overall, it's a nice challenge run if you're the kind of person that has already completed the game on normal and Tactician difficulty, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it for your first playthrough. Lastly, you have the custom game mode, and custom you can set whatever rules you want. You can even have it set at honor mode but at a lower difficulty, things like that. So overall I would say the game does a pretty good job of appealing to a bunch of different tastes with its difficulty settings, but the problem is that the lowest difficulty setting is actually still somewhat difficult if you don't know what you're doing and don't know what to expect. In that respect, I would say having the more or less standard difficulty be the lowest difficulty setting creates a psychological trap for the players, because most people don't want to play games on easy mode. They want to at least play the game on quote-unquote normal mode, but normal mode is Explorer, balanced is actually hard mode, and Tactician is essentially the very hard mode. For reference, a lot of the footage you're going to see in the background is from a multiplayer honor mode run-through I did with a friend of mine. The multiplayer aspect of the game is a little janky. Once you get the hold of the basics, you can kind of get it to work, and it does actually work cross-play quite well. He was on PC, I was on Xbox, but we were still able to play together pretty effectively once you get the hang of it, although it does take a little getting used to with how the UI works.
Abomination, this is your end.
And since we just discussed difficulties, it's probably a pretty good time to bring up the basics of combat for anybody that hasn't played Dungeons & Dragons and isn't familiar with how the system works. Combat in Dungeons & Dragons and in Baldur's Gate 3 is turn-based, so everybody essentially takes their actions on their turn. At the start of combat, everybody rolls for initiative, and whoever has the highest initiative goes first all the way down to the lower initiative. This does bring up an interesting point that in Baldur's Gate 3 you can freely switch between characters at the same initiative step basically at any time and use their movements and actions interchangeably. This is especially confusing when you're doing it in multiplayer, because both players, if they're on the same initiative step, can act simultaneously, which does get a little wonky. Each character each turn has access to one action, one bonus action, and one reaction. The action is essentially going to be the primary focus of your turn. It's usually something big like making an attack or casting a powerful spell. The bonus action is usually something more minor. This can be something like jumping, pushing, or even using an item like a potion. The reaction is weird because most of the time reactions are actually happening on other people's turns, although you will get your reaction back at the start of your turn, and all characters have access to a basic reaction where if they have a melee weapon out and an enemy attempts to leave out of their melee range, they can attempt to make an attack of opportunity against them. Now, one of the things that I think D&D and also Baldur's Gate 3 does pretty well is when you start as a very low level character, there's not a lot you can do with your action, your bonus action, and your reaction. It's going to be pretty basic. But by the time you get to the highest levels of the game, you actually have a bunch of different options for actions, reactions, and bonus actions, and the actions you can do are far more powerful. So it does a good job of scaling, although there are a few plateaus where a character will suddenly gain large amounts of power just because they hit a specific level. But in general, you will usually get a good bit of time to get accustomed to these jumps in power level before you get to the next one. Now, as some minor tips for somebody who hasn't played Baldur's Gate before, there are some things that you kind of need to know about. The game doesn't really tell you all that much. The first one is your spellbook. You can actually change what spells you have slotted in between encounters basically at any time. It's not super important, but there are some specific story beats where characters might require things like a healing or a restoration spell in order to interact with them, and if you do have something like a cleric in your party, even if they don't have that spell memorized, they can just go to their spellbook and swap it out. There are also two generic bonus actions that are used a lot more in Baldur's Gate 3 than they are in a normal game of Dungeons & Dragons. The first one is the jump bonus action, and the second one is the push bonus action. The push bonus action can push somebody out of melee, but it can also push somebody off a cliff, so it's pretty handy. Additionally, the jump bonus action can be used to jump not just over obstacles, but you can even just use jump on flat level ground to give some extra distance so you can get closer to targets if you have a melee build. And jump is also based on your strength, so the stronger you are, the further you can jump. So by the time you get to the end of the game, your melee characters that are strength 20 or 22 can probably jump almost as far as they can walk. The last tip I'd give for Baldur's Gate 3 is that there's actually a separate reaction menu for each of your characters, and every available reaction will have 3 different settings: yes, no, or ask. Yes means it will always do it if it sees the opportunity, no means it will never do it, and ask means it will always ask your permission. My personal opinion is that you should set everything to ask, and if you just find there's one you're never using, you can set that to no. The reason why I'd say you want to do this, it won't matter that much early in the campaign, but once you get to the later stages of the game where your mages have things like counterspell, you don't want them automatically using their reaction to make an attack of opportunity and bop somebody on the head for a few points of damage when they could be counterspelling a big powerful enemy spell. But all of that brings me to another minor critique about the game. One of the problems and one of the reasons why the game can be so difficult is because a lot of the enemies are set up in a fashion that is intelligent to make for an interesting encounter, so if you just walk headfirst into it, they will often have the advantage. What makes this awkward is that if you've played a lot of other RPG games, you've probably had the trope of you go up to an enemy, you tell them off, and then you immediately start a fight. But for a lot of the encounters in Baldur's Gate 3, you don't really want to talk to the other person. You want to set up all of your characters, you want to make sure you have your priorities laid out as to who you want to attack, and you want to go down the lines of enemies as quickly as possible. So this is a little awkward because if you're used to other RPGs, you might be inadvertently doing something that you probably shouldn't do and just going up to people and saying, yes, let's fight. Baldur's Gate 3, I won't say it won't let you do this, you can do this. Depending on build and difficulty, it is sometimes viable, but it's usually one of the worst ways in which you can approach an encounter. Baldur's Gate 3, much like Baldur's Gate 1, is all about planning, preparation, knowing what the potential threats are, and already having a plan for how you're going to deal with them before you even start making attacks. Ideally, you want to do a surprise round. Now, if all of your characters are hidden and you hit an enemy with an attack, you will then have a surprise round where all of your characters go, none of their characters go, and then your characters get to go again in the next turn. So especially if your party has high initiative and they roll higher than the opponents, they basically get 2 rounds back to back before the enemy gets 1. Optimizing this kind of stuff is really how you make the best of doing the higher difficulty runs, and even in the lower difficulty runs can be incredibly handy for taking less damage and using less resources in a fight. So in general, it is kind of annoying that if you want to optimize a lot of combat encounters, you're actually incentivized to talk to people as little as possible instead of just straight up fighting them. And this is disappointing because the writing and the characters are actually quite good and quite interesting. Now, there is one aspect of Dungeons & Dragons combat that is carried over to Baldur's Gate 3, and honestly, even a lot of D&D players tend to get this wrong or forget about it, and that is concentration. Some spells in their description are listed as requiring concentration, and what this is your character is having to devote some mental energy to keeping the spell up. You can't have more than one spell that requires concentration up at a time, so if you try to cast a new concentration spell, the old one will end even if the new one fails. But importantly, every time a character takes damage, if they have a concentration spell up, they need to make a concentration check, and if they fail the check, the spell will drop. The reason I'm telling you this is not just so that you understand how your own spells work, but there's a lot of enemy spells that use concentration, and hitting the spellcaster just to try and force them to drop the concentration spell, even if you're only hitting them for very small amounts of damage, is a viable strategy. If a wizard casts Dominate Person so they control one of your party members, or Hold Person so they keep keep one of your party members paralyzed. Doing damage to that wizard, even if it's very minor, can force a concentration check and break your party member out of the effects of that spell. It's important to remember that in Baldur's Gate 3, much like in Dungeons & Dragons, while the enemies do have different stats and everything, they generally operate along the same axis as the players do. So while it certainly sucks for the party to be stuck in a damaging area of effect spell that slows you down, it also sucks just as bad for the enemy to be stuck in that same spell. And that also neatly segues into another interesting point. Even on Tactician mode, I noticed that the enemies were incredibly bad about avoiding large area of effect spells, so area of effect spells tend to be incredibly powerful against all of the enemies at basically any difficulty level.
Improvisation, that's the only way to survive him. Anyway, what were we talking about?
As with all RPGs, I'm pretty sure with Baldur's Gate 3, it is very common for players to spend way too much time on the character creation screen. There are three main aspects of any character you create. This is the race, which also includes their appearance, then you have their background, which is some minor bonuses, and then you have their class, the actual combat class your character will be using. On top of that, there are also three different, essentially, types of characters you can make. One of them is the fully customized character. This is commonly referred to as the Tav, because that's going to be the default name you get, so if you don't rename your character into anything, they will simply be called Tav. And Tavs are completely customizable in every aspect. However, this does come with the drawback that the Tav character is almost more or less a random person that got picked up off the street. They're more attached to the world than integral to it. Obviously, because there are so many different options that players could potentially select, the developers couldn't do a fully personalized story for all of them, so the game will feel less specific and less unique to your character. On the complete opposite end of that spectrum, you have the Origins characters. These are the main party members that you have in a normal playthrough, but you can actually play as one of them. The Origins characters have very little customization, but they also have very involved stories. They have their own personal motivations for being there, so you're essentially guiding them through their own tale. And obviously each of these characters feels very involved and very ingrained into the world. Often they have personal affiliations with many of the heroes and villains that are already present in the setting. And then you have this one mysterious character. This is also an origin character, but it's simply called the Dark Urge. The Dark Urge is about halfway in between a Tav and an Origins character. The Dark Urge is commonly referred to as a Dirge. If you play a Dirge character, you are heavily involved in the world, and many people will know you on sight. Some of them will respect you, some of them will fear you, but you have amnesia, so you don't actually know what happened. And Dirge is fully customizable in terms of appearance and also in terms of class, but not in terms of background. You always have the same background. Now, for me personally, playing as a Tav and then playing as a Dirge back to back, the Dirge has a much better and more compelling story. That being said, the Dirge story also has some pretty disturbing elements, so I can see why Larian didn't have the Dirge story as essentially the default, because it would probably turn off a lot of potential players. However, I do feel it is personally narratively stronger to play a Dirge than a Tav, but that's just my personal preference. I will put a disclaimer on it: the Dirge storyline does get pretty disturbing at points, and you're not exactly playing a great person, especially as you start digging more and more into your history. But I do find having an internal struggle with yourself and still coming out the other side to be a good person to be a pretty compelling story. Or alternatively, giving in to the urges and becoming a complete psychopath can also be pretty fun to do at least one run of. I do have a lot more to say about Dirges, but I don't want to go too much into here because there's a whole lot of spoilers if you start talking about Dirge too much. So I will have a section near the end of the video where I specifically go more in depth into some of my thoughts about the strengths and weaknesses of the Dirge storyline. Now, one thing I do want to know before we get too deep into some of the other customization options, the only two things that you don't have a way to change during the middle of the game are your character's starting race and your starting origin. You can actually change your appearance and you can change your class later in the game if you decide you don't really like it. The different origins each has its own strengths and weaknesses, but for the most part it only gives you some minor skill proficiencies and some extra dialogue options, which, while handy, are not exactly game breaking. The various races are also not as different in 5th edition as they were in some earlier editions of D&D. In older versions of Dungeons & Dragons, the game was a lot more restrictive about which races could take which classes, and even then you also had essentially racial stat bonuses that could dissuade you or encourage you to take certain classes with certain races. In the current edition of D&D, no race is specifically locked out of being any one class, and there aren't even any racial stat bonuses anymore that could make being a class with a specific race particularly difficult. So pretty much regardless of which race you pick, you can be whatever class you want. So regardless of what race you pick, if you do find you're not particularly enjoying the class you have, you can simply respec at any time. I would also note that while the racial bonuses can be pretty handy, especially things like innate damage resistances to fire that you can get on some of the Dragonborns and Tiefling, or some of the armor and shield proficiencies that you can get on things like humans and dwarves, it's not exactly game breaking, so for the most part, especially for your first playthrough, I would just play whatever race you think looks cool, because you can basically make any of them work within the confines of the game with essentially any class. For the classes, likewise, I would basically just select whichever one looks cool. Again, you can just change it if you find it's something you're not particularly interested in. If you think you like hitting things with a sword, go with the fighter. If you think you like casting spells, go with a wizard, and you can just kind of play it by ear. You can also multi-class, so whenever you gain a level, you have the option to put that level in a different class. This is sometimes used for more build optimization, but you can also use it for flavor. You don't really have to do it though. Most mono classes still work pretty effectively all the way up to the end of the game, especially on more standard difficulties. This is where I'm going to warn new players about one specific class, and that class is the Paladin. Whenever you start a Paladin, you have to select an oath. The oaths vary a bit in flavor and sometimes can feel a bit vague in exactly how they're worded, but ultimately, as long as you're following your oath, you have the full benefits of that oath. But as soon as you don't follow the oath, now you're an Oathbreaker, and Oathbreaker is essentially just its own subclass of Paladin. It has a different sets of advantages and disadvantages. As somebody who basically did the entire honor mode run as an Oathbreaker Paladin, I wouldn't say it's strictly worse than a normal Paladin, but once you break your oath, you basically have to atone before you can change your class. You can't just go and change your class at any time like everybody else, which is a little annoying to deal with, especially because some of the criteria for how you break your oath are a little vague. One of the oaths, the Oath of the Crown, is actually incredibly difficult to get through Act 2 without breaking your oath. And this is where Baldur's Gate 3 runs afoul of a minor issue that you have when translating Dungeons & Dragons into an electronic setting, is that normally you would have a Dungeon Master, and if you were doing an action, you could ask that Dungeon Master if it was about to break your oath, or if you were doing something and the Dungeon Master informed you that it would break your oath, you might be able to retcon it or find a way around it. Whereas in this game, you basically just break your oath and you get informed of it a few seconds later when the Oathbreaker shows up, and it's just done. You can't really argue it, you have to atone. Really, anytime you try to translate Dungeons & Dragons from the tabletop to an electronic setting, you're gonna have that problem because you essentially have to preemptively think of everything the players could do and put specific rules on it, as opposed to having a normal human GM that could basically make a judgment call on whether or not something should go a certain way or whether it shouldn't. And to be clear, I think for the most part, Larian did an excellent job of essentially just providing a virtual GM for the players that is for the most part effective at doing so. I just think when you start getting to classes like the Paladin, it gets a lot more nebulous as to what is an Oathbreaker, and there's not really a good way around it. Once you're done selecting your origin, your character's race, and also your character's class, you then get dumped into the screen where you have to design your Dream Guardian. This is essentially your imaginary friend. Once you're done customizing your imaginary friend to your heart's content, you can then give your character a name and start your epic adventure.
We are free. Our freedom is ours, friend.
After you finish messing around with all the different character customization options, you will be treated to the opening cutscene. In the opening cutscene for Baldur's Gate 3, we start with Cthulhu, who is putting a worm into a frog person's eye, then he grabs a second worm and puts it into your eye. Then Cthulhu proceeds to take his tentacle ship on a sightseeing cruise into a city where he abducts a bunch of people, and then some dragons teleport in being ridden by frog people and proceed to chase Cthulhu in his tentacle ship. In his infinite wisdom, Cthulhu decides the best avenue to escape the frog people riding dragons is to go into literal hell with literal devils. Even if you as an individual are pretty invested in Dungeons & Dragons and the cosmology of the various planes, you're probably going to find yourself pretty damn lost as to exactly what is going on in this situation. And to be at least somewhat fair to Larian Studios, BioWare basically did the same thing in the very first Baldur's Gate. Here's the very first Baldur's Gate intro, and it tells you basically nothing about what you're going to be doing during the game. In both of these cases, by the time you actually figure out what the hell was going on in that opening cutscene, you have already forgotten it even existed. It's basically just there for your second playthrough so you can say, oh, that's what was happening. Unless you have a lot of context, really all this establishes is that you have a worm in your eye, and that's probably not good, or maybe it is, who really knows. The very first section on the tentacle ship is essentially just your tutorial. It gets you familiar with some of the basic controls and also gets you familiar with skill checks, and this is where we have to talk about one of the big areas wherein Baldur's Gate 3 deviates from traditional Dungeons & Dragons. In Dungeons & Dragons, there is no such thing as a critical pass or failure on a skill check. It is not a thing. Critical success and critical failure only applies to attacks. In Baldur's Gate 3, however, you can critically fail or pass skill checks. You critically fail if you roll a 1, regardless of your modifiers, and you critically pass if you roll a 20, regardless of your modifiers. The reason why this isn't a thing in traditional Dungeons & Dragons is because traditional Dungeons & Dragons is pretty open-ended in terms of how you approach situations or what the players can try to do. So if the players try to do something completely insane, the number they need to roll is so high that they could never hit it. You can't have a player automatically succeeding at something that is impossible just because they rolled a 20. Whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, you can more tightly control what your players are specifically rolling for, which means that you as a developer have much tighter control over the success and failure states of that action. It's not like a normal game of Dungeons & Dragons where your player can simply say, I try to jump across the Grand Canyon, and rolls a die. I mean, in an actual game of Dungeons & Dragons at that point, you're just rolling for fall damage to see what type of resurrection spell you need to get your party member back. You're not actually ever going to succeed no matter what you roll on that d20. So while the system is different from traditional Dungeons & Dragons, I do think it works very well within the digital medium. But that doesn't mean that it won't be endlessly annoying for dungeon masters that have to constantly deal with players that have only played Baldur's Gate 3 thinking they will critically succeed if they roll a 20. This part of the game is also where we get introduced to the narrator, and I have to say the narrator managed to accomplish something that most other RPGs, at least on PC, fail to do. So in Dungeons & Dragons and any other tabletop game, you have the difference between the character knowledge, the person that you're role-playing and that actually exists in the world, and the player knowledge, the person that is role-playing them. The character would in theory know things that the player doesn't, just because the player doesn't live and breathe in that world. And the Baldur's Gate 3 narrator functioning as a sort of internal monologue to essentially tell the player things their character would already know is probably the most effective way I have seen any game do this. Many other games just try to accomplish this by either having tons and tons of journal entries you would have to read, or having these really awkward conversations where your character has to have lengthy discussions about things they should already know about. By having a narrator function as your own internal monologue, they can remind you of things that your character would already know about without having to have your character ask really stupid questions to everyone they meet. And if you want examples of games that stumble a bit with the player and character knowledge difference, you can look at games like the Mass Effect and Dragon Age series, where the responses given in the conversation wheels don't always align with what your character is actually intending to say or will say, whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, the narrator does a great job of clarifying what an individual response might actually mean. Going into Act 1, your tentacle ship has crash landed in the wilderness, and now you have to find your way to somebody that can help you remove this worm from your brain. This is also where we start getting our first major interactions with other NPCs and also our fellow party members, and this is where I have to gush a little bit about how well written and acted the game is. It's kind of surprising to see a AAA game where they manage to get a lot of voice acting talent in one place and also get them moving in the same direction. And I'm not even just talking about the main voice actors, even a lot of the bit characters are incredibly well done, and this shows that there was a very strong direction given to the voice acting. actors. So when your voice actors or actresses are working on something like a video game, they don't have a lot to work with in terms of what they're acting or reacting to. So getting the most out of these individuals often requires a good voice acting direction to help them understand what's going on in any given situation when they're reading off their lines. So while the writers and actors definitely deserve all of the credit, I do feel the voice acting direction might be one of the unsung heroes for this particular game. But that does raise the question of what do I consider to be good writing? And in my humble opinion, good writing often boils down to giving the player information without specifically telling them that information. For example, if you were to play a drow, a dark elf, in Baldur's Gate 3, you would find a lot of information out about the world simply by how other people react to you. Many other races will assume that your drow is evil or just kind of an asshole. The goblins will automatically acquiesce to you. You don't even have to pass a skill roll to convince them to let you through. This tells you a lot about the drow without having to have a specific paragraph that the player has to read or some awkward dialogue line that the player has to deliver in order to kind of figure out where the drow fit within this world. But above and beyond individual line writing, there's a lot put into the game that make the characters feel more real. And one of the big aspects, especially when dealing with your companions, is often your companions are serving a patron and the patron asks them to do something. And you can talk them out of doing the thing, and they will approve of you talking them out of doing the thing. And that's the funny part, is the approve-disapprove rating can feel very gamey, but in this particular instance, it actually adds a lot to the conversation. So if your companion is about to do something horrible and you talk them down and they approve of it, they're approving of you getting them to not do something that they wanted to do because they were morally conflicted about it. It just feels weird to me that while this approve-disapprove system could be seen as very gamey, the points at which it shows up actually does tell you a lot about the characters, what they like and what they dislike, above and beyond the very basic stuff. Some characters like it if you compliment them, others almost want you to insult them or be a lot more combative. One of my favorite moments in the game that actually shows off the writing pretty well is when you're dealing with one of the main villains near the end. You can make a deal with the villain to essentially share power with the plot MacGuffin, and the villain will later ask you to give the plot MacGuffin to them, and if you refuse, they will demand it. But if you pass the insight check, they don't actually want the plot MacGuffin, or they kind of do but kind of don't. What they actually want is they want an ally that is strong-willed, that will stand up to them. They're a tyrant that is used to having vacillating subjects and used to having absolute power, so they don't really have a lot of allies or equals that are strong-willed that they can go up against. So they actually want you to say no, and they want you to deny giving them the plot MacGuffin even though it is objectively better for them if you follow their orders. And this kind of shows the level of writing with Baldur's Gate 3 in that the characters come to the story with their own interests and their own desires and their own goals, and aren't simply one-dimensional constructs trying to do one very specific thing. This is also where it's a fairly convenient time to start discussing the various companions, and overall I think the companions are very well written, they're very well acted, and most of them have pretty compelling plot arcs, with a few exceptions. The core cast of Shadowheart, Lae'zel, Astarion, Gale, and Karlach are all pretty compelling characters, and seeing them grow and develop with you throughout the game and ultimately where they end up by the end is very satisfying. However, not all characters quite hit the same. For characters like Jaheira and Minsc, I'm willing to give them a bit of a pass, simply because those characters are legacy characters from the original Baldur's Gate, so the main part of their plot arc has essentially already been concluded by Baldur's Gate 3. But you do have some other companions that feel like they're less well developed. Halcyon spends roughly a full act, depending on exactly how fast you get to certain events, just sitting in your camp basically doing nothing. He has a very truncated character arc and honestly doesn't really get to do much in the broader story. Minthara also feels like her arc is pretty truncated because you don't get her as a full party member until basically sometime around Act 2, depending on exactly when you decide to trigger certain events. Minthara for the longest time was also incredibly difficult to recruit as a party member unless you were doing a pure evil run. Larian has since made it considerably easier to do so, and this is where we get to one of the more annoying aspects of the game, that is non-lethal damage. At any time, you can swap your entire party to doing non-lethal damage, and in this mode, your melee attacks will not kill enemies, they will simply leave them unconscious. This is only used for a handful of times in the entire game, and it turns out 2 of the times they are used to recruit party members, which is really annoying. I wish non-lethal damage was either more heavily emphasized or was just excluded entirely, and they would just have critical party members basically drop to a knee or something, and you could choose to spare them or execute them. In fact, they actually do this with a very minor character later on in the game, so I'm not sure why they couldn't have done this for characters like Minthara, but anyway. So ultimately, what annoys me about non-lethal damage is that it's used about 3 or 4 times in the entire game, but when it does come up, it's actually very relevant in terms of whether or not you can recruit and interact with interesting characters. But going back to Minthara, and while she is annoying to recruit, she's probably one of my favorite companions because she's just evil. She's not really a reformed villain, she's just a villain that wants to kill the same people you do. And I do appreciate that they don't really try to force some kind of arc where she sees the power of friendship and becomes a good person. She's just still kind of a bad person all the way up to the end of the game, but she's a bad person that you work with through the game. Of course, the party member that they screwed up the most on, and honestly even Larian kind of admitted this, is Will. Will's plot arc is not really much of an arc. Will is ultimately a good person who signed a pact with the devil in order to get power to help people out, but the devil likes to toy with him and abuse him because he specifically is a good person. But there isn't really a character arc here. Will stays a good person. He doesn't hesitate to do the right thing, even as the devil puts him in increasingly awkward positions. So it's not really a character arc. He's basically the same person at the end that he was at the beginning. It's just he spent the entire story get beat up by his patron. Also, I love that they treat it as a surprise that Will has this devil patron, even though it's literally on the box art. It's like how they try to play coy with Asterion being a vampire, even though he's the most obvious ass vampire in the history of obvious ass vampires, but anyway. But ultimately, my issue with Will is that his entire character arc is just him getting beaten up, and Larian admitted they had to cut a lot from his character and basically tie him into another subplot with the Duke Ravengard, just because of time constraints, and it is kind of a shame. Like, he's not a bad character, but it feels like there's a lot of interesting ideas to explore of a good person having to turn to infernal power to save people. Ultimately, the reason why I don't use Will that much, and the reason why I kind of just keep him on the sidelines, is because I feel kind of bad for him. By putting him in positions where he needs that infernal power, I'm kind of encouraging him to continue to be in this abusive relationship with his patron. Look man, I don't need Eldritch Blast that much. You can just stay in camp and have a sandwich or something, you know? The first act of Baldur's Gate 3 takes place in the wilderness around the crash site of the tentacle ship, and honestly is probably the best done part of the entire game. It has a lot of NPCs, a lot of interactions, and also a lot of variance in terms of how you can accomplish the various quests or missions you will be assigned by NPCs. Most of Act 1 will revolve around a 3-way conflict between the druids, who simply want to protect their own territory and keep their own people safe, the tieflings, who are refugees who are simply trying to make their way to the cities of Baldur's Gate, and then the goblins, who are just psychotic assholes who want to murder everyone. The game definitely expects you to sympathize more with the tieflings, who are just trying to get back to some form of civilization, and the druids, while a bit extreme, are at least somewhat sympathetic. Honestly, even going to the goblins, who at first seem like they're just a bunch of bloodthirsty assholes, when you actually work with them, they're pretty grateful to receive your attention. In fact, the goblins in general are very clearly on the bottom rung of the social ladder, so they appreciate any real attention or aid that you are actually able to offer them, and also generally give deference to you if you are working for Team Evil. Honestly, for all their faults, the goblins did kind of endear themselves to me a lot more than the other various minions of Team Evil, who are just kind of crazy. While Act 1 does largely center around this conflict between the goblins, the tieflings, and the druids, it also sets a lot of stuff up for later acts, including an overarching plotline with an evil cult and a bunch of repeating heroes and villains. While I have very few complaints about Act 1 specifically, there are some general issues that start to crop up. The first one is that Baldur's Gate 3, much like Dungeons & Dragons, is very much built around the long rest, short rest cycle. In order to get back all of your spells, all of your hit points, and recharge all of your once per day effects, you have to take a long rest. For every long rest, you can also take 2 short rests. For the most part, the short rests only recharge hit points, although there are a few other things you can get back on a short rest. Now, the problem with this system is that the long rests that you do at your camp are actually where you get all of the scenes with your various companions and a bunch of story scenes. However, it's also where you recharge all of your abilities, and the game can't have you recharging all of your abilities for every fight. So the game requires you to use camp supplies in order to conduct a true long rest, otherwise you only conduct a partial rest. So this limitation on camp supplies dissuades the player from simply long resting all the time, but this also means it's very easy to miss various scenes with your companions or with other parts of the story because you're either low on supplies or you don't want to burn them. This is part of the reason why they have the partial rest in the game, so you can potentially trigger these camp scenes without necessarily having to use supplies, but it just feels very video gamey, and I honestly wish they had come up with a better solution for this. The other minor issue in Act 1 is that some things trigger and then will trigger again on a long rest, but it's not exactly clear what does and doesn't do this. For example, at one point in Act 1, if you get close enough to part of the map, you will see a burning building, and if you long rest afterwards without going into the burning building, everybody in the building will die. But there's not actually a time limit. It's not timed per se, it's just kind of sort of timed. You also have another interesting issue in that if you leave the druid, tiefling, and goblin conflict going on long enough and try to exit to another area, the game will give you a warning, but it won't specifically stop you from doing so. But by doing so, the druids will complete their ritual and will actually kill all the tieflings. It's a very weird thing where it's not timed. You can take infinite number of days, but as soon as you hit a specific threshold, it will go off. So unless you already kind of sort of know what the triggers are for certain events, the game is very nebulous on whether or not certain things do or do not have a time frame in which you need to do them. One thing for me that differentiates Baldur's Gate 3 from a lot of other traditional RPGs is that in a lot of other RPGs, you'll get dialogue options that will specifically relate to part of your background. For example, if you're an elf ranger, you'll get background options related to being an elf ranger. However, in the vast majority of games, all this is used for is to provide you with some sort of advantage. That is to say, every time this option comes up, it is essentially objectively the right decision and will always resolve whatever situation you are currently in. It's basically just a nice little bonus and nothing more. In Baldur's Gate 3, however, the options related to your specific background, whether it be race, background, or class, are actually a lot more variable into whether or not they will help or hurt a situation. The easiest example, and one that you'll run into very early in the game, are the tiefling refugees. If you are specifically a tiefling while dealing with the tiefling refugees, you will get tiefling specific options. And generally, because you are dealing with other tieflings, those options are pretty helpful. However, you'll also get tiefling specific options while dealing with people that have decidedly negative opinions of tieflings, and selecting the tiefling option there is often a lot more confrontational. It will make the person like you less and may even start a fight. In essence, these options are purely for role-playing. Sometimes that role-playing is beneficial and sometimes it is detrimental. For example, the Drow and the Durgar are from essentially societies in the Underdark, which is a very harsh environment, and their societies tend to be quite cruel. So a lot of the dialogue options specific to those races are somewhat asshole-ish. However, there are some scenarios where you kind of want to be an asshole, especially when dealing with the bad guys. But there are also obviously a lot of people who are not going to like that. Another example on the flip side would be the Paladin class. Paladins are something of an arbiter of justice, and while some people appreciate that, some people very much don't. And these types of options are why I specifically consider Baldur's Gate 3 a role-playing game, whereas a lot of other games that are classified as RPG I wouldn't exactly consider an RPG, simply because in a lot of other games there's no real role-playing, whereas in Baldur's Gate 3 you do get the option to take less than optimal decisions in certain situations, simply because it's something that your character, because of part of their background, might do. One of my favorite examples is at a certain point in the Underdark you encounter a sword that is stuck in the stone, and you realize that there is a blood rite ritual that you can do to free it. And if you are a Lolth-sworn drow, you can basically say, Lolth, the evil spider goddess, would not approve of this ritual for weaklings, I'm not going to do that. There is no mechanical benefit to selecting this option, it's exclusively there for role-playing reasons. Once you get done messing around in Act 1, then you have what I would more or less call Act 1.5. There are two different transitional areas that you can use to go from Act 1 to Act 2, and one of them is considerably larger than the other. The game presents it as though this is some kind of choice where you have to choose to either go through the mountain pass or through the Underdark, but this isn't a choice. You can just go to both areas, and that's part of the reason why I dislike the way in which it is presented to the player. But the other issue is that while as a player I want to go to both the mountain pass and the Underdark because there's a lot of content there and some of it is relevant to your companion storylines, it makes literally no sense for your character to go to both places. So for me, this is really where some of the cracks in the game start to show, because I imagine a lot of people, because the game is giving you a good sense of urgency that you need to try and get to Act 2 because of that whole, worm in your head thing, that people are going to take one route or the other, that they're not going to thoroughly explore both. Whereas you kind of should explore both. There is a fair amount of content, and the content is pretty interesting. So this is the first big point in the game where there's a big disconnect between the player and the character, because the player wants to explore all the content, see all the interesting areas, talk to the NPCs, do quest relevant stuff for the party, but the character just wants to get rid of the worm in their head and doesn't really know or care about any of that.
I will never tire of sitting on dead men's thrones.
Going from Act 1.5 to Act 2, we end up in a cursed land with an evil fortress, and the evil fortress contains all of the answers we've been looking for as to what's going on with the worm in our head, the evil cult, etc, etc. It also contains one of the first of the 3 major bosses that you're going to have to deal with in some capacity during the game. We'll call this one the General. The other 2 are the Tyrant and the Assassin. While I personally like the cursed aesthetic of both the surrounding area and the town surrounding the castle, where everything has been warped and twisted, the game also has this really annoying mechanic where if you stray away from a very specific type of light, then your characters start to slowly take damage and will ultimately be cursed and turned into evil minions fighting you. And this mechanic is so annoying and tedious to deal with that I'm gonna just go ahead and tell you the answer right now, even though it is a little spoilery. If you kill the Drider and you take the Drider's lantern and you release the pixie from the Drider's lantern, the pixie will actually give you an item that lets all of your characters have this light without having to have anyone carry it. So basically you can just ignore this mechanic if you kill the Drider, take the lantern, and free the pixie. But that also brings up one of my other issues with Act 2. The Shadow Curse is very annoying to deal with for you, the player, but as your character probably isn't loving being in this deeply cursed area either. So both you, the player, and your character want to release the Shadow Curse on this area for slightly different reasons, admittedly, but this is an area where you get ludonarrative synchronicity, where the player and the character's desires neatly align, and the game just fails to pay it off at all. There is a quest to cure the Shadow Curse from the land, however once you complete it, you are helpfully informed by an NPC that it turns out you actually have to kill the General in order for it to truly be removed. So basically you have the classic D&D campaign trope of a load-bearing boss where once you kill him everything else will all of a sudden be fine for some reason. But even after you kill him, it's not actually fine. You have to be basically leaving this area permanently before you'll get a small little cutscene that will show you some of the areas regrowing. And I think this is a major missed opportunity. Obviously the development time of adding 2 completely different areas, one cursed and one not cursed, would be fairly prohibitive, but at least after you kill the main boss and the curse should be lifted, they could simply do a zone but without any real NPCs or quests other than some basic NPCs going from the shelter basically on the road to Baldur's Gate, and it would still make you feel like you had done something productive to help the area. As it stands right now, it should be a really dramatic and really uplifting moment to cure the curse, but it kind of just doesn't matter for the most part. The second major failure in Act 2 is Act 2 is all about the big guy's evil fortress, and there's a resistance group trying to fight it, and you can recruit the resistance group to help you assault the fortress, and there's a specific trigger that once you hit it, you are locked into this course of action. So it should be this really dramatic battle where you and all of your allies storm the fortress and you take down the bad guy, but that's actually not what happens. This is the single worst way you can absolutely do this encounter, and the reason for that is If you hit the triggering event, now all of the enemies in the bad guy's base are essentially in one room, which means you fight everybody in the goddamn tower at the same time, which is the worst way to do it considering how many high-level fighters and spellcasters there are, and your allies are honestly kind of useless in this battle. It is the single worst way you can do it. You should definitely go through the tower and clear it 4x4 beforehand, because as long as you take out the little guys that alert everybody else to your presence, you can just close the door, clear a room, go into the next room, close that door, clear that room, etc, etc, and you can keep the fights nice, small, and manageable, and you can control the action. But what makes this worse, and what really annoys me, is that there's no option to not do it. As soon as you trigger the event, the assault is going to happen and all of the bad guys are collected in the room, and it doesn't necessarily tell you that's going to happen. So if you don't know about this beforehand, it's very easy to stumble across the worst possible way to conduct this battle. And as I said, the game can be punishingly difficult, and even more so when you have a room of 20 or 30 high-level NPCs. Normally I would applaud a game for subverting expectations by not giving into the trope of gathering your allies and assaulting the evil fortress, but honestly I think this was just a mistake on the developer's part in terms of encounter balance, and that this was supposed to be a lot more triumphant than it really is. But irrespective of all that, you ultimately go into the evil boss's lair and defeat them, and this is also one of those weird points in the story where you don't really get an option to truly align with Team Evil, which was kind of weird because you got an option to complete all of Act 1 as Team Evil, but if you try to align with Team Evil in Act 2, you're going to realize your goals are a little bit incompatible with each other, and you're just going to end up with a very awkward prison break mission.
You will be the one to slay Orin.
So we have successfully escaped from a crashing tentacle ship, we have solved the issue between the tieflings, the druids, and the goblins, traversed hazardous lands to get to the ultimately cursed area, gathered our allies, and assaulted the bad guy's Doom Fortress. And then Act 3 starts. So we probably need to talk about the elephant in the room, because once you make your way into Act 3, you're going to be confronted with the giant city of Baldur's Gate and at best pretty nebulous objectives as to how you're supposed to complete the remainder of the story. This drags the pacing of the entire game to an absolute crawl. Act 3 in Baldur's Gate is like getting off work on a Friday afternoon, your drive home is going pretty well, and then you see brake lights and emergency vehicles up ahead, and you realize that you are nowhere near as close to getting to the end as you thought you were gonna be. It is that much of a sinking feeling when you look at this giant city with no clear objectives as to how you're really supposed to be proceeding. And this is also probably a good time to bring up the standard video game act structure. In Act 1 of an RPG, usually you have a relatively narrow space, but a nice bit of room for you to stretch your legs a bit and explore the RPG elements. It's more controlled, it's lower level, and generally less threatening. Then you get into Act 2 and the whole world opens up. You get a bunch of open world areas to explore, a bunch of stuff to do, a bunch of side quests, and then when you go into Act 3, the entire focus of the plot in the game narrows considerably as you start making your way towards the final objective. Baldur's Gate 3 kind of screws up this formula by flipping Act 3 and Act 2. Act 2 of Baldur's Gate 3 is relatively linear. There are some side quests, but for the most part, your objectives are pretty straightforward, as is the place where you need to go and the person you need to take out. In Act 3, the world is a lot more open-ended, there's a lot more side quests, and the way forward is considerably more open-ended and nebulous. If you had gone straight from the wilderness into the city of Baldur's Gate, and then the actual last act was going through the cursed land to assault the bad guy's Doom Fortress, yes, it would be a little cliche, but it would be a lot more satisfying and it would have a much better organic flow to it. One of the other issues with the current orientation in terms of how everything is situated in the story is that when you go into Act 3, the game needs a reason as to why the tyrant and the assassin aren't simply attacking you on sight and ripping you to pieces, especially considering that the tyrant basically controls all of the city guard and the assassin is, well, an assassin that can blend in with anyone. The game just has to bend over backwards a bit to figure out why you can even move freely in the city at all without being harassed constantly by the city's guards or having assassins appear and stabbing you in the back. Whereas if the city was Act 2, they basically wouldn't know you from Adam and wouldn't know that they needed to be trying to kill you. On top of all of that, Act 3 is also where the game is having to increasingly strain itself to piece together your somewhat incoherent actions up to this point. Certainly some players are going to do all good or all evil, but a lot of players are going to do a mix of both because they don't really understand where all of their decisions are going to lead. So a lot of Act 3 is the game having to bolt together a lot of these different decisions in a way that kind of sort of makes sense and keeps itself going. And in addition to that, it also tries to pay off the decisions that you made earlier in the game and give you NPCs to talk to and interact with that can tell you how terrible or great your decisions were earlier in the game. So this is the part where you're going to see most of the cracks in terms of the narrative, or NPCs having to stretch themselves a bit to allow you to keep interacting with and moving through the city in a way that is useful for gameplay. In reality, what you would probably need to make Act 3 work is you would basically need two completely different cities. One in which you are being constantly hunted by the city guard because you're opposing the tyrant, and another in which you're working with the city guard and thus you can move freely without being harassed. There's also another relatively minor issue. I don't think it's the biggest contributing reason as to why Act 3 feels like more of a crawl, but certainly for somebody on their first playthrough it could be a factor, and that is the difficulty ramps up pretty dramatically. Act 3 has a ton of boss fights against fairly powerful enemies, and because you can essentially be max level for any of these fights, all of them are statted for you being max level, and it is very easy, especially as somebody on your first playthrough, to miss a considerable amount of XP on your way getting there. There is enough XP in the final act to basically get you up to max level, but that requires taking your fights in a very careful order. If you go into Act 3 as level 8, which I did do in my first playthrough, it is actually incredibly difficult to find the fights where you can actually level up in a reasonable fashion and get to the point where you can take on the final enemies. And I want to clarify, it's not that I think Act 3 is bad or that in a vacuum it is poorly done, I just think it occurs at the wrong point in the game. It has some good quests, it has some good NPCs, some of the boss fights in Act 3 are fantastic and are some of the most memorable if you actually get to them, but I also think there's a valid reason why a lot of players, when they get to Act 3 and see this giant city and very nebulous goals in front of them, choose to restart the game with a new character instead of continuing. Once you wrap everything up in Act 3, deal with the assassin and the tyrant in whatever way you see fit, you then get the final assault. And the final assault is honestly pretty short and sweet, all things considered. You get all the plot MacGuffins in one place, you get the final big bad, and then you get the decision to be the ultimate hero and save the day, or the ultimate villain and ruin it. And I gotta say, some of the evil endings for Baldur's Gate 3 are probably some of the most evil that you can get in video gaming. And that's kind of your lot. If you did select one of the good guy endings and enough of your party members are left alive, you'll have a nice little reunion scene with them at the end of the game, but overall at that point you are complete and roll credits. The next part of this video review will involve a whole lot of spoilers, so I will put a timestamp skipping over that to the final conclusion if you want to avoid any spoilers and you want to do a blind playthrough.
You were murder. Pure murder. No excesses.
So I have to absolutely praise whoever on Larian's team came up with a concept for the Dream Guardian. Because ultimately, this is the spoiler section, the Dream Guardian is essentially the projection of the Emperor, who is a manipulative mind flayer that is trying to get you to cooperate with him. But how do you represent a narcissistic and manipulative individual who can see into your thoughts, trying to create an avatar for the player to interact with? Well, what if you just get the player to design their own avatar and you call it the Dream Guardian, so the player will think that it's positive and will be more inclined to make it a friendly face that they're going to trust? Ultimately, Larian, by making the Dream Guardian customizable by the player, is getting the player to manipulate themselves into trusting this character. It is a masterclass in how to do it. It's a rug pull that I don't think you could really do twice, but it works incredibly well in this game. I imagine the majority of people playing it through for the first time will trust the Dream Guardian because they got to customize them. Why would they get to customize a villain? Except it kind of is the villain of the campaign, the Emperor is not a particularly good person. All of the hallmarks of narcissism are there, such as giving you excessive praise when you do whatever they want, or calling you stupid whenever you do whatever they don't. Every time you go against the Emperor, he's very aggressive and very violent about it. He's basically just a classic manipulator, and whoever Larian came up with the idea to give the players the option to customize their own Dream Guardian, 10 out of 10, excellent job. I just don't think it would have hit the same if they had tried to use some kind of procedural generation system, and this ends up working incredibly well in terms of getting the player to basically manipulate themselves into trusting this character. This also brings us into the whole Dark Urge discussion, and I do love the idea of Dark Urge. I love the idea of you playing somebody who was formerly a villain but got amnesia. In fact, it's very reminiscent of Knights of the Old Republic and Darth Revan, which is also a BioWare game. But anyway, I think it was a great idea, but some aspects of the execution, in my opinion, are a little questionable. The first one is it feels very weird that Dark Urge can be any class. What point did Dark Urge become a priest of Saloon? Was it on a dare? Did they get really drunk? I need to know. You also have the other hilarious situation of Dark Urge becoming a monk, an individual who has absolute control over their bodies, minds, and surroundings, except when they just compulsively kill people in their sleep. Like, I'm sorry, some of these classes just make basically zero sense for Dark Urge. Additionally, Dark Urge is supposed to have killed thousands of people before the events of the game, and if you're starting the game as a level 1 Bard Dark Urge, I've played Bards in D&D, I'm not killing thousands of people, I'm gonna die to a tavern full of commoners. The other problems I have with Dark Urge kind of have to do with the timelines getting really fuzzy. When I was playing as Tav, it really seemed like this was a plot that had been brewing up for years and years, especially with the whole Ketheric Thorn Shadow Curse thing going on in the background. But it turns out when you start talking to all of the NPCs and you realize that actually Dirge was one of the first individuals to get the tadpole, this has probably been going on for at most a few months, and I have so many questions about how this exploded all the way up into the point where it's at in only a few months. Especially because when you have Mizora, she's being held captive for presumably at least a few days and doesn't end up getting tadpoled. The whole thing just feels very weird and inconsistent in terms of how the time frames interact. You also have the other issue in that apparently Ketheric Thorn and the Mind Flayers were just living in Moonrise Towers for 100 years or so, not related to this plot in the slightest. Like, were they just his roommates? Were they paying him rent? Did he invite them upstairs to grab a beer and watch the game? Like, what exactly is going on in this particular relationship? Then you have the whole Gortash and Dirge relationship, where apparently they just both decided mutually that they were going to steal the crown of Karsus, and for me this just made the whole evil plot less sinister and more kind of some stupid slapdash thing that everybody came together while drunk. Like, Dirge and Gortash decide to break into Old Man Raphael's place to steal the crown of Karsus, and then when they get it, they have no idea what to do with it, so they go over to their buddy Ketheric's house and slap it on the Elder Brain he's been keeping in his basement. The whole thing just feels incredibly slapdash when you play it from Dirge's perspective in terms of the overall timelines and how rapidly everything happened. But I think one of my bigger issues with Dirge is that Dirge just comes across as borderline irredeemable. It's not just that your character has killed thousands of people and hatched a plot and started executing a plot to enslave the entire world with the ultimate goal to kill everyone, but it's the fact that your character didn't realize the error of your ways. You didn't have a change of heart and decide to defect to Team Good Guy, and that's why you got stabbed. You just got stabbed because Orin wanted Ball's attention, and that's really about it. Your character didn't join the good guys of your own free will. You joined because you didn't remember who you were and you had no other options. And for me, this really makes the redeemed Dirge feel kind of dodgy as a character, because it's hard to redeem all of the stuff your character has done. On top of that, your party seems a little too chill with the fact that you're the entire reason that they're in this mess to begin with and potentially about to be turned into Mind Flayers. It really just feels like the game has to handwave how redeemable Dirge really is in order for the game to happen, which gives it a little too much of a player character energy. So despite the fact that I do love doing Dirge playthroughs for how strong the narrative is, and I do think it makes the Dirge story more compelling because you're resisting these urges that you've had for your entire life in order to shed them all, and even shed your own father, the god of murder, in order to save the world, I also feel like your character maybe gets away a little too easy for what they've done. And this also kind of highlights another core problem in that if your character is not resisting the Dark Urge, but rather is embracing the Dark Urge, everybody in your party should basically just try to kill you on the spot. Admittedly, Jaheira does do just that, but it really feels like nobody else should be putting up with this or risking the fact that you're going to do this again, and they should all be attacking you, you know? You have to imagine Dirge turning around to the rest of the party and saying, yes, I know this terrible situation that we're all in is literally because of me, but it turns out I actually think it was a really good idea and I'm going to continue doing it right now. With all that being said, it very much feels like Act 3 was built way more for Dirge than it was for Tav. It makes very little sense for Orin to not just stab Tav in the throat and take the Netherstone from Tav, and it also makes very little sense for Gortash to deal with Tav and think that Tav can deal with Orin. So in general, it feels like a bit of a stretch to have both of those two NPCs trying to vie for your attention or your favor and get you to deal with the other one first. But if you are Dirge, it actually does make a lot of sense. Gortash really doesn't like dealing with Orin. You were the first person he originally made a deal with, so it does make sense that he would try to reinstate that deal. On top of that, Gortash is a pretty manipulative person. If Dirge kills Orin, then the problem is solved and you don't have to deal with a crazy person anymore. If Orin kills Dirge, then Gortash can just say he delivered Dirge to Orin and try to get at least some level of favor from the absolute lunatic. On top of all of that, from Orin's perspective, it makes a lot more sense for Orin to not want to kill Dirge on the spot, because Orin doesn't care about killing Dirge. Orin cares about getting Baal's favor. Orin knows that you were once the favorite, you were once the golden child of Baal, and she wants to take your place, but simply killing you doesn't quite do that. She wants to kill you in front of Baal to show that she is superior, so it makes more sense for Orin to deal with you than it does for Orin to deal with Tav. And in general, I just love a lot of the little reactions from NPCs that remember Dirge. Some of them hate you, some of them fear you, some of them laugh at how far you've fallen from where you were previously, but in general it does feel like a lot of the game was built around Dirge and not necessarily being built around Tav, which does mean some aspects of the game that have to get Tav to a certain location can feel like a little bit more of a stretch than they do with Dirge. So let's start migrating our way towards a bit of a conclusion. There's an old expression about damning with fine praise. That is to say, the big picture stuff has so many problems that you have to complement the little picture stuff. But Benjamin Yahtzee Croshaw also recommended the opposite, praising with fine damnation. The more small things that you have to find wrong with the game, the better the overall picture is. And for me, a lot of my critiques of Baldur's Gate 3 are very much praising with fine damnation. The overall story, the overall plot, the characters are all very well done, the environments are very well realized, the entire world just feels like a real world, and the characters feel very three-dimensional. And generally speaking, while the combat is challenging, unless you're doing some kind of specific challenge run, pretty much any build can get through the explore or the balanced game modes, albeit the more unoptimized you are and the more you stumble into fights instead of planning them carefully, the more you will have to use the quick save and quick load buttons, but it is still viable. So on the whole, I think the game is fantastic. This is basically everything I would ever want from a digital Dungeons & Dragons RPG. It has the character moments I want, it has the options I want, it has the role-playing options I want. Overall, it is just a fantastic game that is very well done by Larian, and honestly, I hope we're going to see more installments in the Baldur's Gate series from them in the future. It is just overall a fantastic experience. And to close out this video, I'm going to leave you with the unedited footage of my 1v1 duel versus Orin the Red in Honor mode. So because this is in Honor mode, it is at the highest difficulty, and there also are no takesies backsies, so if I fail this, I don't have the option to reload. So enjoy that as the credits roll. If you like the video, like and subscribe, always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.
Demands a pure